is an honorary professor at Victoria University's College of Arts and Education, which means that she is in that wonderful position of having retired and can luxuriate in her now chosen profession of psychoanalysis, interestingly enough. But anyway, she's the author of Anti-Disciplinary Protest, which is it's over there, she's got a copy there, 60s Radicalism and Postmodernism, and also Confronting Post-Maternal Thinking, Feminism, Memory and Care. She's been actively involved in both Arena Journal and Arena Magazine for many years and served as consulting editor for the magazine. She was going to offer a paper on psychedelic feminism, which sounded fine to me. I thought terrific. But decided instead, maybe she thought it was late afternoon and the little crowd need to be stimulated in another way, and take us instead back to the yippies in Chicago in 1968. And the title of her talk is The Festival of Life, Chicago 1968 Through the Lens of Post-Truth. Julie.
Okay, thank you, Anthony, and thank you, Michael, and to the University of Wollongong for inviting me to speak, and it's been a rich array of stories. My paper's a little bit more formal, so you may, hopefully you won't have a snooze at this time of day, but it relates, I suppose, most closely to what some of the things Philip was saying. So I'll certainly talk about Breitbart and a little reference, give a bit of a reference to the alt-right in America at the moment. And it also relates very closely to Wendy's discussion of situationism and also her trial, the theatrics in the trial. Okay, so it's got a bit of an introduction and it'll become relevant hopefully as the paper develops. In the film Hypernormalisation by British documentary filmmaker Adam Curtis, there's a section on Vladislav Surkov, who's been described as Putin's puppet or Putin's Rasputin, and his central role in keeping Putin in power in Russia. According to Curtis, Surkov brings a background in avant-garde theatre into the heart of Russian politics today by turning politics into a strange theatre where nobody knows what is true and what is fake any longer, and where reality can be manipulated and shaped into anything you want it to be. Curtis quotes an editorial about Surkov from the London Review of Books, quote, "In contemporary Russia, the stage is constantly changing. The country is a dictatorship in the morning, a democracy at lunch, an oligarchy at supper time, while backstage oil companies are expropriated, journalists killed, billions siphoned away. Surkov is at the centre of the show, sponsoring national skinheads one moment, backing human rights groups the next. It's a strategy of power based on keeping any opposition there may be constantly confused, a ceaseless shape-shifting that is unstoppable because it's indefinable," end of quote. The documentary Hypernormalisation, which is available on YouTube, it's about 2.5 hours, and it's Curtis's montage with a commentary from the BBC archives, and it's a really amazing film, and controversial and wonderful and free. Of course, which is very 60s of it. The documentary was released in 2016 before Trump was elected, but the shadow of such a possibility falls on every frame of his remarkable film. After documenting some of Surkov's stage-managed media spectacles and theatrical antics, Curtis argues that, of course, real power is elsewhere in Russia, completely out of sight and behind the scenes. What is crucial is that Surkov is quite open about what he's doing, and he lets everyone know he's backing left-wing opponents to Putin one day and neo-Nazis on the other, and openly relishes his role in spreading bewilderment about what is real and what is fake. Now, whether Surkov is a yippie or was influenced by the antics of Abby Hoffman or Jerry Rubin is not my question today. However, there is a lot of commentary, both popular and scholarly, and some more persuasive and some less persuasive, some very problematic, about the countercultural roots of the alt-right in the US, the far-right in Germany, Sweden and France, and countercultural elements in various right-wing online subcultures. It's a connection that is tenuous at best and needs to be challenged. There's always a politics about cultural memory and forgetting, and the legacy of 1968 appears now as highly contested as it ever has been. I like the term Todd Gitlin has recently used to describe this as the undead 60s, and I'll return to this notion later. My question here is about what lens we use when we look back and conduct retrospective analyses of 1968. And as such, it's a question about the politics of memory. If we look through the lens of post-truth, which I'll go on to define, what comes to light, if anything, about the countercultural carnival that was planned as the lead-up to the Democratic Party convention in Chicago in 1968, the Yippie-orchestrated and named Festival of Life, to counter the Convention of Death that was the Democratic Party. And that's an actual poster of the event with the Yippie address in New York, and that's available on eBay, which just shows they were right to worry about being co-opted all the time. So before discussing the festival aspect of Chicago 68 as opposed to the police violence that occurred and by which Chicago 68 is usually remembered, and before outlining the various rumours deliberately circulated by the Yippies in the lead up to the convention, I'll attempt to define post-truth. While we might be tempted to think of post-truth as simply lying, as in the phrase fake news, it's come to work on a much more subterranean and affective level. In the words of political theorist John Keane, post-truth interrupts the background noise of conventional politics and public life. It may involve lying. It may also involve buffoonery, theatrics, jokes, absurdist exaggeration, and various tactics of distraction and destabilisation, with the aim of spreading confusion and the sense that reality is multiple and mutable. In our affect-oriented media landscape and digitised environment, emotional responses and their residues remain long after a spectacle is superseded or shown to be based on a lie. So a recent example to illustrate this would be the doctored video of that the White House shared of a CNN journalist, Jim Costa, apparently chopping down on the arm of a White House intern. As we came to learn, the video was altered by speeding up an image of Costa's arm reaching in front of the intern to actually grab a microphone, and what was deleted was Costa saying, "Pardon me, ma'am," which is a very American sort of thing to say, and very polite. The doctoring was done by a far-right conspiracy group and was circulated on their website called InfoWars. And then it was recirculated by the White House. But importantly, in a post-truth political landscape, subsequent knowledge that the video was fake does not necessarily cancel out its intended emotional effect. The general impression that the press cannot be trusted, that they are rude and aggressive and the enemy of the people, to use Trump's term. But the truth and the lie seem to sit side by side, leaving an unease about our own perceptions and the sense that any knowledge can be on stable foundations. The lack of any sense of shame about this manipulation or distortion of fact, or any embarrassment or apology by the White House, just adds to this sense of destabilisation. Okay, so let's turn to 1968 and the Yippies and the way key figures in the group, which it was officially formed, there's lots of rumours about that as well, at the beginning of January, that New Year's Eve of that year. And key figures, Abby Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, Paul Krasner, Stu Albert and others experimented with spectacle while critiquing it at the same time. The Yippies referred to themselves as psychedelic Bolsheviks. And as I argued in Anti-Disciplinary Protest, so it's a book I wrote 20 years ago, they developed a distinctive language of protest that distinguished itself from both the old left and from the new left. And, you know, we've seen that a bit today in people's reminiscences, how, you know, difficult it is to actually categorise the kind of politics that people were engaged in. Their activist strategies resisted the always problematic division between what is considered political or cultural radicalism. In my book, I identified some of the features of an anti-disciplinary language of protest. This included a rejection of hierarchy, leadership, and conventional political organisation, much like the New Left critiques of bureaucracy. So that's not the way in which it was different. But the Yippies and similar groups went further by challenging the idea that radicalism should involve political commitment, seriousness, and sacrifice, and that even having strategies, plans, coherent aims, or comprehensibility should be abandoned. In short, a rejection of the discipline of politics. Incoherence is mightier than the sword, Abbie Hoffman wrote. I'll just an image of him. The Festival of Life, August 25th to the 30th of Chicago, 68, was meant to be a cultural gathering standing in opposition to the Vietnam War and militarism, and an example of alternative values and an alternative vision of political protest. Yippies promoted a form of pranksterism and theatricality where the symbolic became as important as the actual events at the convention. About the infamous Pig for President campaign, Hoffman points out that the myth of the pig became just as important tactically as the actual pig called Pegasus. Apart from the logistical problems of managing more than one large pig in the streets of Chicago, a Yippie faction apparently emerged and demanded a much meaner pig, and this signalled to Hoffman, and to use Hoffman's words, the real pig became superseded by the myth. He writes, quote, "I dropped the hint that we were considering running a lion. In the end, thousands of pigs were used, real pigs, pig buttons, nice pigs like Mr. and Mrs. Pig, and bad pigs like the cops, Daly, Humphrey, and the politicians. It was shades of Animal Farm." On YouTube, there's a short recording of a film of Abbie Hoffman discussing the Yippie guerrilla theatre tactics as a lead up to the 1968 Democratic National Party National Convention. And in answer to a question, it's worth Googling, in answer to a question from a young, like-minded looking man about whether demonstrating in Chicago was a risk, and this young man said, "Wouldn't it be like protesters herding themselves into a stockade?" Hoffman reassures him by saying, if you act crazy enough, they can't touch you. Well, we know he was wrong about that. But he gives the example of how in the lead up to an earlier event, the levitation of the Pentagon in 1967, anti-war protesters, when they were in their planning stages, became very concerned about the possible use of a chemical tear gas called mace by the police. And so Hoffman says, okay, so we invented our own drug spray called LACE, L-A-C-E, made up of a chemical of our own. Then he gives an example of it's got LSD, he lists all these various drugs that, you know, that kind of fictionally meant to be in this chemical. So we organised a press conference and squirted coloured water in a water pistol at a couple who immediately started to fuck in front of the journalists. We then threatened that we'd use lace on the National Guard at the Pentagon demonstration. As Hoffman boasts, this complete fabrication, called lace, was later reported in Time magazine, and this is Hoffman's words, as, quote, a fact. No hoax, no quotes, no nothing, lace, our drug. So, A range of similar threats were made by the Yippies in the lead up to the Democratic Party convention, their so-called warm-up events. And these were all duly reported as truth by the mainstream and underground press of the day. There was the proposal to pick up Democratic Party delegates at the airport in phony taxis and to drop them off miles away in Wisconsin, to take over the Chicago biscuit factory company and distribute bread and cookies to the masses, to stage a mass nude-in at Lake Michigan, to take cherry and apple pies and present them to the Chicago police, and of course to put LSD in the public water supply. A huge free rock festival was planned, and theatre groups from around the country had pledged to come to Chicago. Workshops were also intended to be held to cover commune development, draft resisting, guerrilla theatre, and how to establish an underground press. Accounts of what actually happened at the Festival of Life varied, and Jerry Rubin later even contested Hoffman's version of events, even contesting the idea that there was a rock concert, and I think Stephen was there in Chicago at that time, and it's possible there wasn't, because I think the parks were closed, there were all sorts of, anyway. However, in keeping with the Society of the Spectacle, the truth was not what mattered. Indeed, there was a recognition that the Yippies were simply a reflection of a distortion of reality that was occurring in mainstream American society. This is a quote from Abbie Hoffman again. The United States political system was proving more insane than Yippie. Reality and unreality had in 6 months switched sides. It was America that was on a trip. We were just standing still. How could we pull our pants down? America was already naked. What could we disrupt? America was falling apart at the seams. Yet, the term post-truth sits uneasily with other ways of remembering the Festival of Life and its aftermath and the 60s counterculture. While in 1968 the Yippies explored the political uses of fake news, they retained the belief, mistaken as it turned out, that this gave them a wider platform from which to convey their more revolutionary and radical ideas. The Yippie idea that the media could be easily manipulated to the advantage of radicals was challenged by those who identified more with the New Left. Tom Hayden, for example, thought it was a dangerous strategy and that the media always needed to be treated with caution. He saw the media as the enemy of the anti-war movement. Todd Gitlin had a different view to this, and he identified at the time a growing alliance between the media and liberals, where opposition to the war became something that was respectable at the expense of more structural analyses of the fundamental problems of American society. There were suggestions also that Yippie antics put other protesters at risk of violence in certain demonstrations, and perhaps the most conventional view that's sort of passed down in the way we forget and remember 1968 is the idea of the Yippies as sort of clown-like and therefore non-threatening. Interestingly, this was one of the perspectives that Abbie Hoffman's lawyer exploited to defend Abbie Hoffman against the charges of conspiracy, the charges of planning and organising a riot in Chicago 1968, in the infamous Chicago 8 and later Chicago 7 trials. Despite attempts to turn the trial into only a media spectacle, the idea that reality could be manipulated and shaped into anything you wanted it to be, if you like, a post-truth notion of endless malleability, was shown to have its limits. As Nick Sharman has documented in his study of the media reportage and the actual trial transcripts, Abbie Hoffman actually spent a significant and clearly observable time outlining the details of his political philosophy. He outlined his extensive political work in the civil rights movement and the political and philosophically coherent nature of his non-violent plans for the convention. But notably, this did not receive any significant coverage by the New York Times during the trial. The New York Times, of course, was much more interested in and indeed comfortable with reporting on the costumes worn by Hoffman, his mockery of the conventions of the court system, and the politics of theatre rather than the theatre of yippie politics. When I was going back to primary documents and secondary material about this, I thought, look, in fact, you could see this as a metaphor for the very simplified way the counterculture has often been viewed by later commentators. And as we know, in the dominant cultural memory of the 60s, it is one of costume and style, which, as others have mentioned, that's important, the design elements, all those sort of things. But it kind of has come down as something like mere frivolity, rather than the substantial and far-reaching rejection of militarism and consumer capitalism that it actually was. To return to the opening of this paper, Vladimir Surkov apparently uses post-truth tactics in Russia, tactics of destabilisation to maintain the status quo in Russia today and to quell or neutralise opposition. In my view, the yippies used a logic of post-truth in a very different way. They used post-truth tactics to spread and fuel opposition and dissent. And according to Stu Albert, in an interview with Nick Sharman as late as 2005, they also aimed to make young people feel braver and safer about mobilising against war in Vietnam and the injustices of capitalist society. In 1968, Hoffman outlined his aims as, and this is in the introduction to Revolution for the Hell of It, his book, quote, "Nothing short of destroying America and its institutions of racism, imperialism, capitalism, and the Protestant ethic." To my surprise, on rereading the 1970s introduction to this book, Revolution for the Hell of It, so it was written 2 years, his new introduction, his 1970 introduction was written 2 years after the events in the Festival of Light in Chicago. Hoffman challenges the prevailing notions of activism, including his own, by recognising the following, and this is a quote from him. "Women's liberation, more than any other movement to emerge in the last 2 years, forces us to examine our style of living. To enter the 21st century, to have a revolution in our lifetime, male supremacy must be smashed, including," and this is important, I thought he said, "including the chauvinism of this book." So it was a kind of a self-critique there. Something that actually I hadn't noticed 20 years ago when I was doing research for anti-disciplinary protests. Certainly, what was considered to be truth in 1968 was put into question by the yippies in their celebration of what they called the pure imaginary. As Hoffman wrote in 1968, pure imagery in the end was actually truth. Yet in an interview in 1987, 2 years before Abbie Hoffman took his own life, he described himself, contrarily perhaps, as essentially a leftist. Quote, "I believe in the redistribution of wealth and power in the world. I believe in universal hospital care for everyone. I believe that we should not have one single homeless person in the richest country in the world." And he kind of goes on and talks about, his beliefs about what the CIA should, how it shouldn't exist, what it shouldn't be able to do, etc. So if we look back at the Chicago Festival of Life, what undead 60s survives, or to use another phrase from Gitlin, quote, "What shadow presence of 68 can we detect?" The yippies have been the model for the expressive politics of many subsequent social movements. So just to give it an example from a few, the direct acts of theatre by actor in the late 80s and early 90s, the guerrilla communication of anti-consumerist culture jamming groups of the 1990s and 2000s. The impersonator duo The Yes Men, who are noted for their radical disruption and political parody of corporate events. Certainly the anti-globalisation movement that combined protest and festival in what they called protestables. And to go back to the opening of this paper, Pussy Riot, and they challenge both the politics of Surkov and Putin as a striking example of a legacy or the use of yippie critiques and yippie tactics. And also, in my view, the maternalist feminist peace activism of a group like Code Pink today. These developments are important to remember, particularly when we hear that the alt-right has roots in the counterculture, or when other blame the 60s narratives or rewritings of anti-disciplinary forms of protest continue to gain such traction.
Thanks very much, Julie. I might start the ball rolling for once and ask, isn't it the case that the only performer of any note, certainly from the folk music scene in Chicago, and this might include the rock scene, I'm just trying to remember if MC5 were there or what, I don't think so, was Phil Oakes.
Yes, and there was a reenactment in August this year of the Festival of Life and the Yippie, sort of kind of descendants of the Yippies. I don't know whether any are actually still alive. So they travelled through the streets of Chicago this August. They were playing Phil Oakes, and I think Phil Oakes' partner was there as well.
Right.
Yeah. So certainly, I think you're probably right. It is hard to find because the press and the primary material is full of all the fake, all the post-truth stuff. You just don't know what really happened.
But it is often forgotten Phil Oakes was a founding member of the Yippies.
He was. Yeah.
And because the Oakes style is very different. It's much more traditional, old left, out of the folk scene, etc. And yet he had this very great affection for Hoffman and Rubin. And in fact, Sonny Oakes says that when Phil was in his last stages and before finally committing suicide, it's an incredibly sad story, of course, that Jerry Rubin was actually the one who kept connection.
Okay.
And that's interesting.
No, Sonny is...
Sonny's Phil's sister.
Yeah. I think she was the one that was involved in the reenactment.
In the festival, yeah.
Well, I mean, Abby committed suicide too.
Yeah, of course.
That's very sad as well. Yeah,
Jerry,
in 1987.
When did Jerry go?
I think he went earlier from a heart attack.
No, he walked into a car.
Oh,
Yes,
did he?
it was a car. Phil Oakes was 76.
Yeah. I think Hoffman was about 58 or something like that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting, and generally often described as a bit of a humorless Trotskyist, but you've definitely confirmed my affection for Abby Hoffman, who's pretty cool. I really agreed with your critique of making some comparison between the alt-right's manipulation of the media, and I agree with Abby Hoffman's own description of himself. He was essentially a leftist, despite his own kind of critique of the existing lefts, old and new of the time. And I think the kind of thing that comes down to is when the far right and the fascists try and manipulate the media, they are attempting to reconstitute a new truth. When Hoffman, there's a democratic content to the Yippies attempting to manipulate the media, and that's exposing how the entire edifice of capitalist media is actually a lie, including the ones they slip in there kind of thing. And so I think actually saying the difference is they're connected to this mass movement, it's profoundly liberatory and democratic. They're trying to expose not just the little lies that they get in there, but the lies that the whole system's built on, whereas the alt-right are trying to, their George Soros conspiracies and all of that rubbish. They actually are trying to pull the wool over people's eyes and reconfirm the the rise of society.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And I mean, and there's the sort of the difference between something with an emancipatory content and something with a fascist content, and you know, this overestimation. Look, it mainly came from Angela Nagle's book Kill All Normies. And she argues that there's this link between the counterculture because certain online right groups are iconoclastic and sort of culturally expressive and those sort of things. But you know, the differences are bigger than any similarities. And also the culture industries and neoliberal capitalism marketizes everything anyway, all those identities. So are they just grabbing one of those identities, or is it just another way they're going back to say, well, we can damage the 60s? There is that thing which apparently is particularly strong in America still, according to Gitlin, that he says in every presidential election, 68 looms there, like, you know, a shadow. You have to say, yeah, why?
No, it's just interesting to contrast the post-truth analysis you give, which I fully support, to what actually was happening as well in terms of complete control over the experience of particularly the people going to the Democratic Convention. Mayor Daley was the guy who's in charge. And for example, just before the convention, there'd been major riots through the streets of Chicago, and a lot of damage. And we built billboards all the way from the airport to the convention center, so people couldn't see them. He then was set up in such a way that people, after they got to the convention, could not see anything about what was happening on the streets at all, nothing. They were completely enclosed. But from outside, we could watch on television what was happening inside the convention centre, where the people didn't know what was going on outside. And what was then interesting, I mentioned this to you earlier, Shirley MacLaine and Paul Newman smuggled in a television set. And you could see the people start to gather around them in amazement to see what was on the streets. And those two actors then actually led the movement of the Democratic Convention, people out to support the students. But it was just controlled by Daley to try and make it absolutely, completely outside the decisions and the discussions of the Democratic Party.
And that's really important to know. And it puts the kind of all the effort that the hippies sort of tried to go to try and get something out there that would make people question what's going on at Chicago.
Abby Hoffman was quite a sophisticated operator. He studied under Marcuse and
that's right.
in the Paradise. He knew his Marxism, and he later went back to when he was on the run. He brought out his Marxism, Maoism, and Weather Underground. But he knew the failures of the old left, and that's why he became a sort of clown. But he was very sophisticated in his upbringing.
Yes, that's true.
Did you know that Jerry Rubin's julep was banned in Australia?
No?
It was certainly in some states, and maybe even altogether.
Yeah.
Because we serialised it in Thuranka and Sauranka, because it couldn't be sold here.
So steal this book? No?
Well, I think it was Steele's book, yeah. Or was it
Was it
Stewart?
Do It or
Stewart.
Stewart?
Oh, Stewart.
Well, no, actually,
It was
Do It you
Stewart.
could
Jerry
get
Rubin.
you could get it pretty easily, but
I think after a while you could. But
After a
I'm
while,
pretty
right.
sure it was actually banned at one stage.
Okay.
That's why we ended up.
it was kind of an underground publication in a sense, because I've got a copy of it and it falls apart very easily, etc.
I think Bob Gould had them.
Yeah, certainly Gould had it, yes.
He probably pirated it. He did that with Zap Comics.
The whole trial, the Chicago trial, made a huge impact here, and people were almost certainly influenced by the tactic.
Yes, and I think your examples were very pertinent in that regard.
And there is a kind of a serious way of looking at 68 without taking too many leaves out of Todd Gitlin's book, but certainly he sort of sees that as really the end of one part of the 60s dream and hope and so on. So does Felix, of course. The album he produced with the gravestone, R.I.P. Chicago. almost predicting his own death, and that sort of sense that things came apart there. And a hell of a lot of the radicals, particularly Californian SDSs and so on, wouldn't go to Chicago because they knew it was going to be a bloodbath.
Yes.
And so there's that, we've got to build in that sense of tactical radicalism, and weren't the yippies blind to what was really going to happen?
Yeah. But even Gitlin himself says when he was there and the police or the National Guard were heading towards them, you know, so Gitlin must have been there with other
He was there,
SDSs,
yeah.
and he thought, yeah, this is it. Like, this is the state, and we want people to see what the state's really like.
Yeah.
But it's kind of a quite, that little YouTube thing that I mentioned, I mean, it's a bit sort of poignant in a way, this young guy saying, but wouldn't we be marching into a stockade? And often, no, he was sort of supremely confident. Yeah. No, look, I think just sort of the little bit of research I did for this paper, and going back to some of that material, it's still a really rich area. There's so much that hasn't been looked at and could still be researched, I think.
Has there been research done on how we received it, like if you were going with the mainstream media and not alternative newspapers, how we actually received it in Australia, like through the media?
Philip Fraser put some of Abby Hoffman stuff in High Times, I think, or no, there was. I'm sure.
But I mean, if you were like reading The Age or The Herald, or how much would you read?
Not that I know of, because this guy from Melbourne, he did his PhD, Nick Sharman. His study was of the press. He did a lot of the New York Times reporting, a lot of the underground press, and a sort of Chicago Sun Herald, which ironically in some ways conveyed more of the leftist, or you know, the serious, in quotes, side of Hoffman's testimony than the New York Times. But of course he does make the point that the New York Times would much prefer to be writing about Abby Hoffman than Bobby Seale. I mean, Bobby Seale took it to a different level and made everyone very uncomfortable.
Okay, I'd like to thank Julie very much for a stimulating paper.